this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
On the morning of 6th of June 1944, wharf photographer Robert Capa waded ashore on Omaha Beach during the Allied landings in Normandy. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Under withering fire, Capa supposedly captured over 100 photographs of the chaos and courage of D-Day, only for all but 11 to be lost in a darkroom accident. These surviving images, the so-called Magnificent 11, helped define the visual memory of D-Day and cemented Capa's reputation as the greatest war photographer of the 20th century. But what if the story we've long accepted isn't entirely true? In his book, Back into Focus, the real story of Robert Capa's D-Day, Charles Herrick takes a forensic look at the events of that day, unraveling inconsistencies in Capa's own account and challenging the myths that have grown around his legacy, drawing on official military records, eyewitness testimony and detailed photo analysis. Herrick offers a new and at times controversial perspective on one of the most iconic moments in photojournalism history. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Charles to the podcast today to talk about what really happened on D-Day, how the legend of Robert Capa was built, and what his findings mean for how we understand both history and heroism. Thanks for joining me, Charles. I think we should start with Capa. I'm sure not everyone will have heard of him. For those who are unfamiliar with Robert Capa, who was he?
His popular reputation is of the greatest war photographer of the world. And he covered the Spanish Civil War initially. He then went to China and covered part of the Chinese war against the Japanese. He returned back to Spain for the Spanish Civil War. Once World War II proper, from our perspective, kicked off, he covered some scenes in the United Kingdom, then in North Africa invasion, the Mediterranean invasion, and then he moved on up into England again in preparation for the Normandy landings, and he covered the fighting in Western Europe until the end of the war. After that, when Israel was being set up, he went to cover that because he was Jewish, and that had a certain resonance for him. And he finally ended up being killed in the Indochina War. He was filling in for a photographer who had an emergency at home. He didn't really want to be there, but he was talked into it. Yeah, and he died during an action there. But he's probably best remembered for two sets of photos he took. The first is the one he took in the Spanish Civil War, and that was the falling soldier. It's also known as the death of a loyalist militiaman. And he's also famous for his photos taken on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Unfortunately, both of those were not exactly what they're made out to be, and we'll talk in detail a little bit about that a little bit later on.
The Spanish Civil War, I think, was my first exposure to Capa, and I have a funny feeling when I was at university, I did a module on reportage war photography, and it was the falling soldier was the big picture. You know, how amazing it is, this moment of death as the guy, he's sort of going over a mound or something, and he's shot, and his rifle's in the air, and his head's sort of flung back, and it's sort of action-packed and it's blurry. It's not a super crisp picture. But that picture's problematic, isn't it? We now think.
Yes. When it was first published in View magazine, there were actually two photos, and they looked almost identical. It was two different guys, but they're in the exact same pose. They're in the exact same location. And judging by the clouds in the background, they hadn't moved much, so you can kind of infer that they're taken shortly one after the other. So now they were passed off as real combat photos in the View magazine, but most of the generation had been in World War I, and they had some insight into combat. And so the reader there with any brains could sit there and say, well, this is a magazine exaggerating. But when they were published in the U.S. in Life magazine, it only published the one image. So the American public, all they knew was that it seemed like a real image. Now, kind of jumping ahead in our narrative, but there's always been a certain degree of question about, well, this doesn't look right. The cameraman is in front of the charging infantryman. And that's always a giveaway that something's not quite right. But it's really a question of the power of a caption, because people don't really know what they're watching or they're seeing, and they rely on the caption for it. And they can be drastically misled by whatever the caption says. So there's been a lot of question about it over the years, but the arts community and most of the public, absolutely believe this is legitimate. And then back in, I'm going to get my dates wrong. I think it's about 2008, Professor Jose Manuel Sesperigui from Spain, he decided he was going to go and locate the position where these photos were taken. Now, supposedly they're taken in the area Cerro Muriano in Spain, which was an area where fighting was going on the date that Capa said that he took the photos. The problem is the professor did a very good job of geolocating the site of the photos, and that was in different areas in Cerro Espiejo, which was 30 miles away and well within the loyalist lines. So it turned out that he just linked up with one of the communist militias that he worked with frequently and had staged the photos. And eventually something called the Mexican suitcase surfaced, which was an old suitcase that had a whole bunch of Capa's old films in it, negatives, and it showed a whole series of the same group of guys running here, running there, doing this and doing that. And the guy that was killed in frame whatever is up and shooting in frame, 30 later on down the line. So that really kind of put paid to the images. They were fake. They were propaganda. But there's still a lot of people that, see value in them. Richard Whalen, his biographer, he keeps talking about, well, they may be fake, but they show the eternal truth and essence of combat and death and whatnot. Well, no, I don't believe that at all. A fakery is a fakery, and there's no way you should elevate that as something to be a great artistic or photographic feat. So, but that was his very first war assignment, and he's just a young man at the time, 24, 25, something like that. He faked the photo. He not only got away with it, he ended up becoming a celebrity for it. My personal opinion that kind of set the tone for some of his later work. There's a lot of evidence that some of his other photo stories in the Spanish Civil War were also faked. They're not as popular, and so they haven't received as much attention, but that's my opinion at least.
That falling soldier, I think makes it sort of, you think it's so powerful. It's sort of, it's technically rubbish. It's not in focus. It's all blurry, but actually that, because of the failure of what one might think is a classically great photograph, sort of gives it sort of an emotive feel to it, which when you add the caption suddenly makes it extremely powerful, because there's an urgency and a panic to it, which is, I guess, what we'll see when we come to those D-Day photographs. And I think this is what Capa does very well. The bad photograph is perfect for the story it's said to be telling. It
imparts a sense of drama and tension and fear and combat and the shaky cam kind of thing.
Yeah. It's very well done.
Yeah. But Capa was never technically a good photographer. He never claimed to be, and his friends, when they described him, always mentioned, well, he wasn't technically good, but he did this well, or he did that well. A lot of his most famous photos have a context which excuse the lack of technical merit. I'm not a photographer. I'm not an expert in this field. I'm speaking as a dumb infantryman, but I think my comments are valid. His first big photo assignment was taking a picture of Leon Trotsky at on a fair up in Copenhagen. Now, his newspaper set him up there with credentials to go ahead and take photographs, but photographs came back were really pretty lousy. So he wrapped that story up in the idea of, well, Trotsky had forbidden cameras in the area and photographs from being taken. So I had to sneak in the back door with a group of workers with the camera hidden and surreptitiously take these photographs. And so that's why they're so crappy. They're stuck in there. And he quite often had exaggerated stories that would kind of give him an excuse for the quality of the film.
Up until D-Day, what had his Second World War been like? You know, reflecting back, I couldn't, off the top of my head, think of any Capa photographs up until June 1944. Had he been busy?
The first thing he did was he took a picture in England of some American bombers, and they inadvertently captured the Norden bomb site in one of the pictures. And he didn't pass it through a base sensor. He just dropped it off with his publisher. Publisher went to an RAF censor who wasn't sensitive to the Norden bomb site. And so the magazine that printed that got about 400,000 copies printed up before they realized that was a mistake and had to pull all their issue out and reprint it. He made it to North Africa. He was at the Battle of El Qatar, where Patton defeated the Germans. But he didn't get any real good combat photos. His picture of him up at the command post with Patton and Terry Allen commanding the 1st Division. And there's some ambiguous photos of soldiers here or there, but none of them were real combat photos. He'd done some time flying with a bomber group. He claimed he'd been on combat missions, but his photos don't really show anything. And even Robert Wayland kind of doubted that. His first significant work was probably the Sicily invasion. And that was the one where he claimed he jumped in with the paratroopers behind enemy lines and spent 2 or 3 days blowing up bridges and whatnot. But the reality was he just rode along with the paratroopers in the plane, took photos of them in the plane, and then landed back in North Africa and got his photos into the press channels. He then landed in Sicily about 10 or 12 days after that on a supply ship, followed Patton's army through. Strangely, he wasn't at the actual culmination of the campaign in Messina. He was supposed to be part of the abortive movement of the 82nd Airborne Division up into the area of Rome to coincide with the Italian government changing. And he claimed he was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division, but he didn't go through any of their training. He wasn't anywhere with them. And he didn't show up on the Salerno beachhead until about 5 days later, I think it was, when he came in by sea. And then from there on, he'd kind of followed the fighting in Italy episodically. He ended up in the Anzio beachhead. He landed late the day of D-Day, spent about a week there. And then at that point, everybody knew England would be the center of the Normandy invasion. And so people were started to exfiltrate the Mediterranean and end up in England. And so he moved there as well. And he got there about late February of 1944.
When it came to D-Day, I mean, I'm not sure how did you get yourself assigned to D-Day? My assumption is you can't take every photographer and journalist there'd be armies of them wanted to land. So presumably he had to be selected as the world's greatest war photographer. Was it easy for him to get a place in a landing craft?
Well, I'm afraid it was thrust upon him. It wasn't something he really wanted, apparently. When he first got there, he was supposed to be embedded with the United States Army Air Forces. And he'd actually hung around with the Troop Carrier Command in the Mediterranean a lot. And that particular unit had already moved to England. So that was kind of like a natural association. But that didn't last real long. The SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, their public relations division said, hey, we want some guys to jump in with the paratroopers. You know, we want some cameramen, we want some reporters, we want some broadcast reporters. And so they went around beating the bush, and Capa volunteered. His agency volunteered him to jump. Apparently, he wasn't too hot about this idea because he kept avoiding going to jump school. Finally, Lieutenant Oldman published a book, Never a Shot in Anger, about his experiences during the war. And he was a lieutenant in the public relations division. And he was told, look, get him and the 2 other reporters who have been tasked for this, run them down, make them sign the waivers, and get them to jump school. So he eventually found them at a party late night one night. And they were fortified with bottled courage. He got them to sign the waivers, and they all agreed that 9 o'clock the next morning, they'd meet at such and such location. They'd all go up to the jump school. None of them showed up. So remember, Capa had bragged about this fictional jumping into Sicily. Okay, so now he's actually gotten the chance to do that, and nowhere to be found. So there were 540 some correspondents who are credited to SHAEF. But as you said, only a few of them could actually be accommodated in the initial waves. So there's a group of, I think it was 57 assault correspondents that were going to go in on the American effort. And very few of those are actually going on the beach. There were ones with the Coast Guard. There were ones flying with the Army Air Forces. There were those with the Navy. And then there were some that were coming in later on D-Day. But the initial ones were a group of pools. And one of the pools was a ground photo pool. And what the pool was is they took a select number of people. And the products of those correspondence would then be made available to all the newspapers and wire services for the normal fees, rather than just one agency keeping the photos for their own personal use. So there were 4 of them that were going to go in with the Americans, 2 on Omaha and 2 on Utah Beach. And so Schaeff volunteered Capa to go in with the photo pool at Omaha Beach. But Capa kind of put it, or conveyed the idea that he's going to go land and follow his troops on inland and cover them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the point of the pool was to get photos back immediately, as quickly as possible, at least the photo pool, get them on the wires. And if they were lucky, they could actually be in the evening newspapers on the West Coast on late on the 7th of June. So the idea, in fact, the pool manager specifically told him, look, if you can get your photos back immediately, leave the beach area and do it. And that's basically what Capa and his main competitor, a man named Burt Brandt from another agency. Capa would land with the 16th Infantry Regiment and on one side of Omaha Beach, and Burt Brandt would land on the other end of Omaha Beach with the 116th Infantry Regiment. So they were in a direct head-to-head competition about who's going to be the guy with the scoop. And so that's how Robert Capa ended up on the USS Samuel Chase looking at an invasion from early on. Now, Capa always kind of portrayed himself as really far forward in all sorts of fighting in this situation. He was never that far forward as he made out. So landing in this early in an invasion was really something strange and unique for Capa.
Yeah, he was kind of, one of those people who seems to have liked the moniker of the world's greatest war photographer without necessarily being at the sharp end of the war.
He had it written on his helmet, so it had to be true.
Did he really? Fantastic. Just in case you weren't sure who he was. I wonder if you want to walk us through the timeline of Capa's landing that day. So when and where did he come ashore?
Yeah, to answer that, you have to go back to what he claimed first. He gave quite a wonderful little description in his book, Slightly Out of Focus, about how the night before the invasion, he was facing a dilemma. Should he go in with Company E of the 16th Regiment? They were a company he'd been with in Sicily, and he felt comfortable with them, safe with them. And the problem was they were going to be in the very first wave of infantry landings. So that was kind of dangerous, and he knew that. So the other option was maybe he'd land instead with Company B, which was in a follow-on wave, which had what he thought was a more interesting mission. We didn't explain what that was. And while he was thinking this over, the regimental commander supposedly came up and said, hey, why don't you land with me in the command group at about an hour and a half into the invasion? And Capa said he thought it over for a while, and he decided basically, well, I'm a gambler. I'll go in with the first wave with Company E. Well, Company E was on a different transport. So he wasn't going in with them. The Chase didn't lower its first landing craft until Company E was almost at the beach. So the reality is Capa came in at about, they did come in with the regimental commander. Regimental commander was due to come in at H+95, which would have been about 8:05 a.m. That LCVP was about 15 minutes late. So he set down 0820 to 0815, somewhere in there. And that's based on the reports of 3 people who were on those LCVPs who recorded the times at the time.
That's an hour and 3/4 after the first landings had started.
Yeah, an hour 45 to an hour 50. So a lot of the carnage of the first wave had already happened. And now it's still a deadly beach, but not necessarily where he landed. Now, getting back to the time, though, when Company E landed, the tide was still about 250 yards offshore from the obstacle belt. There's a very gentle slope on the beach, and the tide was rising about 1 foot every 11 minutes. So a little bit of rise in tide would be a lot of movement of the tide upshore. So there's a big difference. The photos he took when he got off his landing craft show that the tide is already moved in the 250 yards, and it's actually through the obstacles. So just a cursory inspection of his photos shows that he did not land at 6:30 with the first wave, as he claimed. He could not have. Now, as you know from the book, I spent a lot of time playing with tides, beach profiles, and basically just trying to confirm that and draw the timeline and see how it fit with other events in it. But yeah, clearly he landed between 8:15 and 8:20.
At that moment on the beach, everyone has watched Saving Private Ryan, and if they're not familiar with the Capa photographs, just look at Saving Private Ryan, because Steven Spielberg has lifted the look and feel of those photographs exactly and made it into the film. So I was going to say, was the beach like, because he's landing on Omaha, is it like Saving Private Ryan as they all get off their landing craft?
Not exactly, and that goes back to where he landed. Omaha Beach could be extremely lethal depending on where you landed. But the defenses were not uniform across the beach. Based on his photos, I've placed him landing about halfway between exit E1, which is to the west, and exit E3, which was to the east. Now, each of those exits were very well defended by strong points, but the interim area on the bluffs was not very well defended at all, very lightly defended. And he happened to sit down. Well, it wasn't just a happening. The regimental commander picked that area out as someplace he could get in, and the fire was so light that he could go ahead and start establishing command of the beach. So it was a conscious decision on the regimental commander's part to land there because of the apparently light fire. And it's a key spot. The first people to land there was assault boat section led by Lieutenant Spaulding. He got across the beach and climbed the bluffs, only losing 3 men in the process, which for Omaha Beach was quite an accomplishment. And the next wave of infantry that came in, Company G of the 16th Regiment, and they followed Spaulding's path up to the bluffs. The two of them were able two units were able to penetrate the bluffs, and Company G went off to seize Colville, and Spaulding's element turned right, and they attacked the strong point defending E1 from the rear. Arguably the first, but certainly the most significant penetration on Omaha Beach. Later in the day, they brought in 9 additional battalions, and 7 of those ended up crossing the beach and penetrating inland through the same area that Company G and Spaulding landed in. Now, that is where then Capa lands after Spaulding's company and Spaulding's boat section in Company G. So he lands there. There were 2 craft in his wave. One was an LCVP and the other was an LCT, a landing craft tank. And there were about 120 people in that wave. And they landed and made it to the shingle embankment, which was the first cover, without losing a man. Now, there was supposedly machine gun fire coming in, and I don't doubt that there was, but it was obviously from some distance and not very effective. So nobody in his wave was wounded or killed before they reached the shelter of the beach.
You've done a tremendous amount of work on these magnificent 11, they're called, 11 photographs we have from Capa on the beach. Saving Private Ryan, as I said, is so much of that start of that. He's drawing for those photographs. And those photographs do seem to depict men struggling, in the surf. The guys are laid round hiding for shelter. But, what is actually happening in those photographs?
It hits to the key, the heart of the matter. He only took 10 photographs. 5 of them were from the ramp of his LCVP. A lot of shaky cam here. If you're aware of the carnage elsewhere in Omaha Beach, the shaky cam thing gives you the impression that's happening there. But a close look at it is you see guys prone, and you see guys behind obstacles, but you don't see the dead people all over floating in the ocean and whatnot that Capa claimed. So once he got off the landing craft or was kicked off, he wasn't really supposed to land. But he said he was kicked off by an anxious member of the landing craft. And it may very well be true. Some idiot up there keeping them from raising the ramp and pulling out. The ramp was kept the machine gun fire from going into it. So once he was off the boat, he only took 5 additional photos. Supposedly he first stopped at a dozer tank, a tank with a dozer blade on it, and sheltered behind it. And so he only took 5 more photos there. And that's all he had left in the first roll of film that he had. 2 of those photos show groups of folks around a couple of hedgehogs, which are the steel obstacles. For a long time, those photos were interpreted as these guys are pinned down under fire, taking shelter from the protection of the hedgehog. But, you take a close look at it and no, they've got the engineer helmet markings and a close look at the photo. I'd like to say I was the first guy to pick these details up, but I wasn't. In the dark corners of the history nerd websites, people have noticed these details since at least the early 2000s. But you see the permacord, which is a detonation cord strung from obstacle. In several of the photos, you can actually see the white explosive charges that are in place on the obstacles. It's pretty clear these guys are engineers, part of the Gap assault team that landed there, who are in the process of trying to blow the last few obstacles in that part of the beach, which they can't really do because there's a lot of troops that are taking shelter in there. So that's two of his photos. He had two more photos that kind of looked further down the beach and did show a pretty good number of troops taking shelter in and amongst a real thicket of obstacles, part of the area that had been. At first look, those look like they're pinned down. It's the narrative. But in both those photos, there are pictures of guys standing upright, walking along the beach calmly behind these folks. So when Life published the photo, the pictures of the two guys walking down the beach were visible, so it didn't betray the image they were trying to get across. So these guys have paused there. We don't know why they paused there, but clearly they aren't pinned down, at least not in the sense of you twitch and you're going to get shot. And his last photo is the famous face in surf. And that shows a man struggling in the water, whether he was shot, whether he tripped, whether he just, had a failure of courage. Well, we don't know, but it's a very evocative photo.
We don't have the negative to that, do we? So we don't know how much it's cropped.
That is exactly right. That's one of the ones where the negative just never appeared. They printed the photo in their 19 June edition of Life magazine, and it's been since replicated, but not from the original photo, which seems to have just disappeared. That was the next to last photo he took. He took some photos out of sequence. He'd take a picture here, take a picture here, and went back to that picture there. But yeah, so there are only the 5 photos he took while he was on the beach. Like I said, the tide was rising about a foot every 11 minutes. But you can see from his photos that he only spent certainly less than 6 minutes taking those photos based on the movement of the tide.
They landed at low tide anyway, so those hedgehogs wouldn't necessarily be in the water at all, would they? Because they were trying to make them visible. So that depicts, obviously, that time's passed. You're not the first wave because there's at least a foot of water for those guys to lie in. And when you make the point in the book that if they're sheltering, what they're sheltering from, because they're laid around the base of the hedgehog, and you think, they're not sheltering from one direction. You're right, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And then you start to look at, and there is a tremendous amount of people sort of, I don't mean stood up, but they're not necessarily combat crawling along the beach. They're sort of moving with some form of haste, but they're not necessarily, don't look like they're directly under fire. It's really interesting to go back and look at them again once someone's offered you a different narrative and you go, oh yeah, this stands up. This makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's real easy to buy into whatever the caption says. And before I got into this real detail, I had some misgivings about it, but I bought into a lot of that. Now, fortunately, in the face of the surf photo, up in the upper right corner, there's a blurred image, and that image turns out to be a LCI, a landing craft infantry that was coming into beach. And that LCI had on board a Coast Guard cameraman by the name of David Ruley. And he was a motion picture cameraman. And as he was beaching, and they were getting off of his landing craft, he took a film clip that was aimed right at the tank Capa was taking shelter behind. And his brief clip shows 2 boatloads of troops leaving the landing craft, moving upright across the beach, no problem at all, and a third group slowly following another tank as it moved up the beach. So that kind of puts the whole lie to, they were pinned down, they couldn't move. The more context, the more cameras you get involved, you start getting a better picture of what was going on there.
Do we know who the face in the surf is? Has anyone been able to recognize themselves?
A number of folks have come forward to claim that. And this happens a lot. You remember the engineers around the hedgehog? I've gotten several folks who've written in and said, well, that's my dad or that's my uncle. And it's 4 or 5 people claiming it's the same person. Richard Whalen's book has Capa coming ashore at beach sector Fox Green. Capa actually came ashore at beach sector Easy Red. Well, because he said Fox Green, people whose fathers, brothers, sisters, whoever had landed on Fox Green, they said, well, that must be my dad because he was wounded and somebody pulled him out of the surf. But no, he wasn't even on that beach sector. So the result is we've got a lot of claimants, but there's nothing that really seems to be plausible at all, unfortunately.
Put a name on it and it turned out to be the wrong beach. It might look like the right guy, but he's in the wrong place.
But you can kind of understand the family wanting to have a connection there. And that was my dad who died later on. And there's a tangible proof of him on D-Day. But it unfortunately just doesn't hold up.
His story about just getting off the beach doesn't hold up. How long do we think he was on the beach? He claims a couple of hours, doesn't he?
Yeah. He gave an interview in D+3 in which he said he stayed almost 2 hours on the beach. He left the beach on an LCI, which departed at 8:50. So at the most, he was there 30 minutes. From the timeline I put together, it's pretty clear that once he saw that LCI come in, that's the one with David Ruley, the cameraman on it, he moved directly to that and he got on as soon as he could, probably within 10 or 15 minutes of him reaching the beach. The LCI stayed around on the beach for a while, unloading troops. Pretty sure Capa boarded it much earlier than that. He was soaked in water from his landing, but by the time you see pictures of him on the LCI, he's already completely dry and looking clean. So he was on the LCI in the engine room long enough to have dried off. And that could only have happened if he boarded the LCI about 10 or 15 minutes after it landed. If
getting onto the LCI, would he know he had a route back to Britain with his photographs? Yeah, and I'm sure that was a lot of incentive for him. He says he had a failure of courage, and there's no reason to doubt that. He wasn't supposed to be there, and I'm sure that ending up in that mess was quite a shock to him. But he also had the incentive to needing to get back. The problem was that the straggler line was the beach, and you couldn't leave the beach unless you were a casualty or a survivor from a landing craft. So getting aboard a landing craft to get out of there under those circumstances would be kind of a challenge. But that landing craft started drifting into a mined obstacle. So the skipper decided to halt the landing and then reposition his landing craft. And apparently it was at the time that he halted the downflow of troops that Capa climbed back up the ramp. The ramp was narrow enough, you could only get one at a time. And fortunately, the skipper of that LCI was a big shutterbug himself. He was taking pictures from his bridge or his conning station during the actual landings. So between him and the Coast Guard cameraman, apparently they decided, yeah, hey, it's legit. Let's let this guy aboard. And once he was aboard, he changed cameras. He apparently only took photos from one camera on the beach, although he supposedly had two. And that film started with exposure 29 out of what would turn out to be 38 exposures on that roll. Was that the Rolleiflex he was using, or the? That was a Contax. So that's the 35 millimeter camera rather than the Rolleiflex you would look through the top. Yeah, exactly right. A little bit better for action type photos. So we don't know what the first 28 photos were. Now, logically, I believe they were probably shot during his ride into the beach, but Capa never said he took a photo during that period. And because he was putting forth the idea that he landed at 6:30, one of his narratives says, well, it's finally getting light, so I finally took my camera out just as we approached the beach. But it makes sense to me that it was probably shot during the approach to the beach and just before the landing. And in fact, Robert Sargent, he was a Coast Guard cameraman that was aboard the Chase. In fact, during the day, Sargent and Capa ended up taking photos of very much the same things from the same points of view, same camera angles. And this happened back in Weymouth Harbor, too. Everything Capa took was duplicated by Sargent, or vice versa. Capa duplicated Sargent's work, or the work of the motion picture cameraman that was aboard the Chase, too. Sargent had gone in with a wave about 40 minutes earlier and had taken a series of photos as they approached the beach and then as the troops exited his landing craft. And they came in under the guns of WN-64, which was a strong point guarding the eastern side of exit E1. And these troops took a lot of casualties. They lost 40 guys just crossing the tank ditch
behind the beach. So his photos were taken under some pretty tough combat conditions, taken earlier in the landing, and yet were qualitatively much, much better, technically as well as the story they told. In fact, his most famous photo is called Into the Jaws of Death. About half the time it's incorrectly credited to Capa.
How galling for him.
Yeah. So Capa returned on the LCI. There's David Ruley. And now Ruley and Capa are taking pictures of the exact same scenes, literally standing next to each other. One still photograph, one motion picture. Now, I'm exaggerating that a little bit. They weren't all the same. Capa then gets his way back onto the Samuel Chase, which is the attack transport he came over on. And who's waiting for him as he gets out of the landing craft there? But it's chief photographer's mate, Sargent, is there again. He's gotten back from his trip to the beach. And now he's taking pictures of the same landing craft that Capa is taking pictures of. And they're taking pictures of the same LCI 85, which had come next to the Chase, and it was in a sinking condition. And they're taking pictures of the same casualties being loaded into body bags. And really the only photos that Capa took that were unique were the 5 photos he took while he was on the beach. And the irony of those is that they don't show any fighting ashore. They're all aimed offshore or just slightly to left or right. Nothing of the fighting ahead of them on the beach, which to me is kind of an oversight for the world's greatest combat photographer. But, people have their own takes on that.
You got to offset that, but he's taken potentially some of the 5 most iconic photographs of the day, showing not necessarily what they say they're showing. So he has at least 2 cameras, potentially a third, yet we have 11 photographs. Do we know how many he thought he took? Do we know what happened to the rest of the film?
He was kind of vague in his comments, and I think he gave 2 different numbers of film that day, and it wasn't sure whether he was talking about on the beach or if it included the trip back to the ship or not. But he had three cameras, supposedly. He claimed he had 2 contacts with him. And then on the aboard the LCI, he started taking pictures with his Rolleiflex, which is a 120 millimeter or 120 format film. From the time he boarded the LCI till the end of his photo taking day, there are 5 packs of film, which comes out to 60 exposures. And we have the last exposure, negatives of the last exposure on most of them. So we're sure he completed all of those packets. So that would be 60 photos afterwards. But as far as of the 35 millimeter from his contacts cameras, there's indications he only took photos from the one contacts camera, the one that had only the 10 photos left on the film. No evidence at all of anything from the second camera, and no evidence he made it to the shingle embankment like he said he did. Now, normally you'd say, well, there's no evidence, doesn't preclude it. That maybe you just haven't found it. And that then goes back to the rest of the legend, which is the missing film was ruined in a drying accident during development back in the UK. Now, I'm not the technical expert on this, but that part of the battle is taken up by J. Ross Bauman and Alan Coleman over on the Photo Critic International website. Ross Bauman, quite a figure in the photographic community. He was the youngest Pulitzer Prize photo winner in history. Many other accomplishments. And Alan Coleman is a major figure in the photo critic field. So when these 2 guys started questioning the destroyed in a lab accident, the dog ate my homework story, it became a serious question, and people started taking it seriously. And they were joined later by Rob McElroy and Kristen DeCuna. And between the 4 of them, they were able to scientifically prove that the lab accident just absolutely was infeasible. The emulsion doesn't melt. The emulsion doesn't slide off the film. The way that they described it, the heating cabinet could not have had the effect. And they experimented with it. They used film from the day. They soaked film in seawater. And then just some obvious things, like supposedly the emulsion had begun to run down on the images.
This is where they were trying to dry it too fast in the cabinet to get it out.
That's right. Well, the problem is the film was dried vertically. So if it was going to run, it would run in this direction, not in that direction. And it turned out the film just looked that way because the film cassettes they were using didn't set well in the camera. And as a result, the sprocket holes were in the exposed area. Well, the guy who had been pushing the lost in the drying cabinet thing was a guy named John Morris. and he was the photo editor and the guy who the photo lab reported to back in London. Capa didn't start this story. He didn't know what happened to his images. As late as July, he was writing his brother saying, tell me how my photos looked. I don't remember what I did or what I took. And he eventually found out when he went back to London in July that the photographs, supposedly, this is what he said, the photographs were ruined in a drying accident. Now, we don't know where he got that story, who originated that story or not, but basically it could not have. And John Morse pushed that story for 70-some years. And then when Alan Coleman and the crew started tearing that apart piece by piece, Morse had some problems trying to accept all this. But in the end, shortly before he died, he said, yeah, it looks like Capa only took the 10 or 11 images. Well, that's a nice admission, but it doesn't really answer the question. What happened to the first 28 on that roll of film? Where did they go? What happened to some of the photos taken with the Rolleiflex camera? Because we only have partial accounting for the negatives from that. And then that goes into, well, what really did happen to them? And I've got my favorite explanation for that, and I think it's most plausible, but we really don't know.
Even before really thinking about it, the idea that it was ruined in a lab, developing it, always struck me as quite peculiar, because I remember as a student, us doing photography and being incredibly incompetent. But it was amazing how robust film was to us lot who'd never developed film before, that we could do an incredibly bad job at least get something out of the photographs. And I thought, wow, how completely incompetent must that lab have been to completely and utterly ruin them, when we would regularly ruin, rolls of films, but we'd get something out of them.
According to Morris, they'd been waiting anxiously all day to get this film from Capa, and so as soon as it came in, they jumped on it. Well, he had two very experienced guys running the lab, but for somehow we're supposed to believe that they passed this critical film off to the young teenage intern, to develop. They used the guy who ended up accidentally ruining the film. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Why weren't the two experienced photographers or developers looking over his shoulder, watching these things? Why'd they let him do it at all?
Well, even if they did, one would assume that as a 15-year-old, if he's been working there for at least more than 6 months, it's all fairly routine. It's not that difficult to process. It was just a bit, it was all a bit peculiar. So what do you think happened to the rest of the lost film? Well,
I spent a lot of time going back and looking at the procedures for how film would be handled. Film would be considered temporarily as secret material until the time it was developed. So when it came in from overseas, it went straight to the censors at the Ministry of Information. Schaefer had some censors there. And the censors are supposed to take a look at the caption notes that accompanied the film and make an initial judgment of how sensitive is this. Well, Capa didn't fill out any caption notes on D-Day. So his film just showed up without anything. Well, that plus the fact it was taken on D-Day probably told the censors that that's probably some sensitive stuff. So they would have classified it as top secret, put it in the hands of a custody officer, and that custody officer would have taken it back to the news agency's lab. And there he would have basically cleared out the lab with the exception of just the minimum number of guys required to develop the film. The film would be developed, and he'd take the film, the proofs, and the contact sheets, and he'd courier them back to the Ministry of Information. And now the censors could take a look at it, and the censors could determine what was cleared for publication. They could clear for publication. They could say, okay, you can publish this, but first you got to erase these details. And on a number of Capa's photos, you do see indications of the red pen from the censor. Or the censors could just say, sorry, we're not going to pass this at all. So to understand this, you have to go back to Operation Fortitude, which was the cover story that we were trying to convince the Germans of on D-Day. And that was that D-Day was just, we're trying to fool you. This is really just a diversionary operation, not that large in scale. And what we'll really do is to come in and get you at Pas-de-Calais with our real main forces. So the censors were very conscious of limiting any indication of the size and scope of the invasion. And they only pass the most benign types of photos. Now, that sounds strange nowadays because if you get on the internet, you can get on the internet, do a search, and you can find hundreds of photos, maybe thousands of photos of D-Days, all sorts of things. But those are almost all taken by military cameramen whose film was stopped and only later became public through the archives or whatever. If you take a look at the film that was passed initially in the first couple weeks of the invasion, it's extremely bland. It's extremely small number. And all the publications were printing the same half dozen or dozen photos. And they showed incredibly vague things like a column of LCIs in the ocean, which could have been taken anywhere, anytime in the world. And a lot of it was focused on the rack and ruin on the beach. I mean, the words are great. We're attacking. We're kicking ass. We're killing Germans. But you take a look at the photos, and the photos don't exactly show that. They show mostly rack, ruin, sinking ships, wounded people. Now, the Germans had various intelligence things, but one of them was open source intelligence from American press, and censors weren't going to let anything be released that counter that. When Life published the Capa photos, D-Day photos, in its 19 June edition, it was actually published on the 12th, but the date was 19th. They had a really telling comment in there, and it said that according to the German press, who are our only source for information, this was happening in the invasion. So the censors really weren't letting much out, and they let out a couple intentional leaks. And that same Life edition, they had a statement by, I think it was Eisenhower, saying, "Yeah, you can expect more landings here shortly," and which was again furthering the fortitude deception. So it's my belief that that first 28 exposures on the film just showed too much of the size and scope of the landing craft off the shore. Too much of the invasion fleet, as it were. Capa's surviving photos are very much of the limited, narrow version of an infantryman stranded in the surf, in the rack and ruin. Most of his photos focused on casualties, dead people, the LCI 30 or 85 sinking, things like that. So it was very limited.
So what we're missing is the run-in, isn't it? Which, as you say, would be those photographs of the Armada off the shore.
Yeah. And other things. The landing craft tanks that were outfitted with 1,100 rockets for bombardment. That was a sensitive thing. It had been used in the Pacific, but there's still considered a sensitive secret item there. The DD tanks, a number of other things. So that's my view. You take a look at the photos he took coming back from the beach. And there's one or two landing craft there, which is very strange and selective photography. There's another photo taken by Captain Wall. Captain Wall was the commander of the Signal Photo Company that had some detachments land early on D-Day. He took a photo of that same area, which had literally scores and scores of craft in it, but his photos weren't passed for publication. So, yeah, to me, there's the very firm hand of the censors had a role in making sure that not too much got out into Life's hands or into the press pool's hand.
Does that mean that somewhere there's a filing cabinet with a lot of Capa photographs from D-Day that have not been looked at since the censor popped them in there top secret and they were wheeled into a vault in the National Archives?
It's or Area 51.
Yeah, it's Indiana Jones sort of moment. They've been just sort of kept away.
And now that may be, my personal belief is that the Army and the other services had a mandate to preserve all their historical films and documents. So they made it to the archives. But the stuff that belonged to private press agencies, they had no mandate to keep that stuff. They were just holding it temporarily until it was no longer classified, at which time the news agencies could come up and get it or not, and eventually be thrown out with one of the normal files, housekeeping kind of shredding efforts. And by the time that Operation Fortitude had been unclassified or at least been downgraded, Paris had been liberated. We were racing the border. We had Market Garden going on. We were attacking the Siegfried Line, and that was just old news. Not only that, but the Life office had moved on to the continent, whereas all of the film was still being held in London. So my belief is that some well-meaning clerk, following the housekeeping instructions, took a look at this stuff, said, "It ain't ours. It ain't classified. Nobody wants it." It goes out.
Charles, we're going to hold it there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. Do you think that, knowing what you know, that these are not necessarily what they say they are, do you think that lessens the impact of these sort of the Capa's 11 photographs?
I do, but my perspective is a guy who's seen a limited amount of combat and a lot of fake Hollywood combat. And so I'm always I don't take kindly to images that have been manipulated to show something that they don't really show. So I really place no value on those. But a lot of people do. A lot of people say, well, it has it captures the essence of the moment. To me, the better ones are sergeants, which are authentic, better technical quality, and actually shows a very good story. I mean, his picture is taken at the center of one of the lanes that have been blown through the obstacles. You can see the tank dozer that was part of that Gap assault team there. You can see the rubber boat the Gap assault team carried their explosives in on. And you see the troops as they're leading the landing craft or dipping down into one of the runnels. And you're getting deeper and coming back up. And to me, it's just a very good story that the photos tell. But a lot of folks will still take a look at Capa's photos and they'll be seduced by either the caption or the shaky cam image. And it fits so well with the Saving Private Ryan narrative because it's kind of a circular thing.
And once you've seen the photograph, it's hard to get Saving Private Ryan out of your head.
It is. I think that for a long time, those photos are going to have some meaning for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I did, because it occurred to me that if you took away the photo, if you now removed the caption, so you remove that context, how much does that change those photographs in people's minds? And if you just say, did it, and not say what they're meant to be, or even if you did tell people, it's a guy in the surf, we don't know what he's doing. There again, that then implies people to imprint upon it, I guess, what they've seen in other things. You can't win, can you?
And, when people come to a magazine or a newspaper and take a look at a picture, what do they want? They want to be, to some degree, in the action. They want to have a feel for it. They want to be in it. So they're already coming to the image with a sense of blind belief, willing to accept what they see because they want to see it. They want to know what happened. And that can be exploited by newspapers or magazines or whatever if they want to try to sex up the photo or give it more oomph or whatever. And it happens more times than you'd like to believe, and it happens today as well.
How's your research been received when you've pulled all these threads together? Does it fall on deaf ears? Do people? Is it like a light bulb moment for people?
It falls into basically two camps. One is a smaller group that says, burn the witch. Fortunately, you just go back and say, well, tell me what I'm wrong. Tell me what I got wrong. What's actually incorrect? And so you never hear anything back from them. But by far, the majority of them are people who said, there's something always bothered me about those photos. And, thanks for pulling it together and explaining it. And just working with another guy on another project here. And he says, I took photography in high school. And that lab accident thing never made sense.
It's a good story. Everything about the pictures is... It's not necessarily the pictures, it's the backstory that someone's put on the pictures that have made the pictures so well known in many respects. Okay, yes, the pictures are very emotive of a moment, but the backstory has really amplified that moment beyond really what the picture should be, which is interesting within itself. And it's fascinating when you deconstruct those pictures and you suddenly think, oh, that's really quite clever how they've kind of... And I guess Life magazine, it's a picture publication, so they need to oversex their pictures.
The first indication of these photos were taken the first wave didn't come from Capa. That came from his book a couple of years later. The first indication came from Life's captions. Capa didn't provide captions, so a guy in New York City is sitting there saying, what should I put on a caption for this? Well, we got a general idea of the carnage on the beach. Damn it, we always have the best photographers in the best positions, so he came in the first wave.
Yeah, we've got the world's greatest war photographer. Why would he not be in the first wave?
It's like in American terms, it's a football team. You got a star player, you're going to amp up that star player. That's part of your brand. Every issue they had, Life had a section on, this is what our great photographers are out there doing. He's here and he's there and whatnot. And amping them up every chance they can get. And that's part of advertising, self-aggrandizement.
I kind of think those combat cameramen and reportage photographers are often overlooked. I think this is such a good view on how are these pictures taken? How did they go to a censor? Who is putting the captions? It never occurred to me before. Who puts the captions on? Because it wouldn't be the photographer. It would go back to the agency. You don't want the photographer rushing back to London to write his own. I mean, I know Lee Miller did a lot of her own writing for her own pictures, didn't she? Which was a different sort of thing. That's not what Capa's doing. It's absolutely fascinating stuff, but very sort of little ever gets written about how this all functioned.
Well, if you don't mind, let me add a postscript here, if we got the time. Capa didn't get the scoop. Burt Brandt's ship was earlier in the convoy and was offloaded 2 hours before Capa's was. And so he got his scoop back. He rode to the beach probably a little bit later than Capa did. He claims he got out, but there's absolutely no evidence. He probably just did a drive-by photo shoot. But he was nonetheless got to Weymouth first and took an airplane to London and had an interview, and his photos got out right away. And so he got the great scoop. Capa was pretty bitter about that. You know, he said, yeah, somebody got back a couple hours before me, but the guy didn't even get his feet wet. He's probably right. But the irony of the situation is that they were both scooped, and they were scooped by two different men. These were military photographers, Army photographers who had landed very early in the operation. A detachment of 4 cameramen, 2 still and 2 motion picture cameramen, landed sometime about 7 o'clock in the 16th Infantry area. And one of those was a guy named Sergeant Taylor. Taylor was wounded on D-Day. But you see a ton of his photos. They're taken at the base of the cliff, motion picture and still from the still cameraman. He was wounded. He was evacuated, and he got his film back to London through the evacuation channels before either Burt Brandt or Capa did. And the other guy was Captain Wall. He was the company commander of that photo company. And he didn't get to the beach till about 11 o'clock. But on the way in, he took some photos, put them in a little capsule, set them off on courier pigeons, and they got back right away. And then about an hour into his stay on the beach, a shell came in, killed the guy next to him, a Stars and Stripes reporter, and traumatically amputated Wall's leg from the knee down. And so he was bundled up. He eventually got on a landing craft, went out to a British destroyer. They cleaned up the wound, and then he refused to give up his camera. He held it the whole time and got back to England before Brandt or Capa, and he got his beach photos into the press before both of them. But you never hear about them. The military cameramen did not get photo credits at the time. That was the policy. The only people you ended up hearing about were the ones working for publications who were advertising their photographers.
Yeah, they're invested in their celebrity photographers. Great. Well, thank you. Hello, listener. That's it for this episode. Many thanks to Charles for joining me to discuss the real story behind Robert Capa's D-Day photographs. His book, Back into Focus, The Real Story of Robert Capa's D-Day, is a must-read if you're interested in photojournalism, historical myth-making, or just want to understand better what happened on Omaha Beach. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Your support helps me keep the show running and allows me to continue bringing you more conversations like this. Next time out, I think we're looking at tanks again. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.